Great, welcome. I think we're here to talk about the value of data sharing. I think everyone recognizes that, but I think there's also many viewpoints on it. And so I think we have a really diverse panel here that we hope to share some of the biggest challenges and opportunities in this area with you.
The one that I actually really would like to maybe follow up on as our first discussion point is the lack of a business incentive to do so.
My point of view is from that as a practicing physician and someone who's taken care of patients for 40 years. So from genetic and genomic standpoint, I just don't think there's any question that we need to have full data sharing of what are the variants that we find in individuals with particular disorders and how those variants are being interpreted and being used for patient care.
Of course, I believe that data sharing is one of the most important things we can do, but I also understand that you have to understand the ecosystem within which we play, and how do you get each player to have the right incentives to do the right thing.
I co-chair the Genomics and Health Roundtable for the National Academies of Medicine, formerly the IOM, and we've studied this question a lot. And it keeps coming down to the kind of concept that the business incentives for this field were aligned really early on making data a commodity and buying and selling it, which we know didn't really even work very well. The early companies that decided to do that are not here anymore. Instead, we know the value is in answering the questions that the people need, the questions that the payers need, the questions the clinicians need answered, but we haven't aligned yet around those questions as a business community.
There's a tremendous value in data sharing. Again, different groups have different value from that data. Is there a role for proprietariness of the data, either for a certain time period, or should it just all be open? Is that the end goal?
It's still a struggle for us to go out and say, we want great genomic data, we need an academic center to come play. You have to be very creative in how you decide to do that, and the community centers aren't doing a ton of genomic work right now, so you're always looking for that data. If we could standardize these data sets in some way and use a federated model, I think then everybody can grab their IP and do the right thing, and the patient will still benefit a lot from that.
The other thing I think that I'd like to stress is this data, I think, ultimately belongs to the patients. And if you ask the patients what do they want done with their data, it's not, oh, I want it squirreled away somewhere so someone can profit off of it. What the patients want is to get advances that'll help them and help other people like them. So it's both a somewhat focus on themselves, but even more than that, this is altruistic feeling that they want to forward the field.
Patients will help to drive the disruption. I think there's two elements to this. I think number one, patients don't really understand the value of their data. So an example would be if a patient really does start to understand that, but when you get your tissue drawn, you really want to make sure your tissue samples are safe. You want to know what genomic testing is going on. You want to know if you can get that done before you start treatment, because it's all such precious information. Same thing with your imaging. But we concierge patients endlessly. None of them know any of this, right? So we're trying to educate them on your data on yourself. Your data as an N of one is so critically important. But your data is even more important in the context of thousands of other patients, because the more we can look at you and see what other people did that looked like you, we can start to put that data set together, which is exactly the vision of where we want to go. We want to make it so that any patient, any stage of the disease, out in the community, in the middle of nowhere, can sit with their community oncologist, and that we have a data set that is large enough. Maybe it's federated, but it is large enough that we can put you in and say, African American, this mutation, you're looking for a transplant. Should you do it or should you not? That's how we really want to democratize care.
Should we focus on a broad data aggregation effort without having clear questions in mind and hoping that data mining efforts and statistics and algorithms will eventually prevail? Or should we start with more focused efforts around critical questions that exist in the market today that are simply not going to get addressed through capital markets or entrepreneurialism.
I agree that it needs to be a balanced approach. I don't think it's an and, it's not an or. And I think to the, collecting data broadly, I think good science is done when someone looks at something everyone else has looked at but sees it differently. And that's part of data sharing and doing novel science based on data collected through other studies.
The advantage of having very specific questions and projects is it allows you to pick the teams that you want to work on that. And like we said, in order to start to figure this out, you have to work with teams that actually have data, that have a decent amount of data, that have a problem to solve for, that have a certain amount of leadership and have money. And that maybe nobody else is working toward it right now. So an example, and I'm just throwing this out there because Lincoln and I were at a meeting last week and we were kind of going through some of these issues, but an example is high-risk disease, which is expensive and a challenge, and patients really care about it because there are patients that die the fastest or are constantly relapsing. It's the same thing now. There's more high-risk disease in prostate. We already know metastatic breast cancer, pancreatic. If you can bring teams together where you say, we're interested in helping these groups out. We know that they have a certain amount of data, but again, we have to look at the full data landscape to say, well, do you have genomic? Do you have clinical? Is it longitudinal? Who else could you work with? How are your academic centers playing? Are they going to be willing to share that data? How do you go out? Do you do it as a contest? And then are your patients engaged, which usually the higher the risk, the more fatal the disease, the more likely you get the patient engagement. But by bringing these teams together, and it was a part of what we were doing under this CRAFT program, is that we bring the teams together, we keep making them work together, but we make them share their best practices. And we can disseminate the findings through case studies and through write-ups where we literally say piece by piece, this is what you ran into. Like when we were asking them all in their ecosystem, and the example we had was Orion, right? Like, and so, and MMRF was there too, but we said, why do you have such a huge multiple myeloma data set? I mean, it just surprised me that he had that many people. And it was because he was funded by Celgene, which is a reasonable answer. My first pharma funders were Celgene and Takeda. They had questions about myeloma. It doesn't mean that Orion doesn't want to go somewhere else and ask other questions. It means he has to go find the funding to do that. When we said, how about payers, or we asked the Prostate Cancer Foundation and others, why are you not working with the payers? The honest answer, it was a small closed-door meeting, but the honest answer was, we don't know them. We don't know them. They don't sit at these meetings. They don't sit across from us. And fortunately, in the meeting, we brought in 5 payers. And we just, well, here they are. Let's talk. And I think that's how you have to start building it, project by project, and hope to get some of those small wins, and then communicate it out to everybody so that we can have those honest discussions of, you know what, it didn't get off the ground because I just didn't know them. Or we just couldn't get anybody to play around the data. But then let's go to the wins and the people that are willing to put the money up, put the question up, put the leadership up, and put the data up.
In the clinical setting, who should be paying for this research? Should it be the payers? Should it be the government? Patients or commercial entities that do this? Maybe I can start with Kathy.
I'm all for the pre-competitive space where we all pitch in and you again rally around the question and you bring in the people that need that data to answer the question, and you make everybody pay up front as a pre-competitive consortium, and you get an early look at the data. You know, when we first did this with the pharma companies on Compass 1.0, I felt like maybe we gave them too long of a window, but now all the data's in and it's flowing, and but I would shorten that window. And I would also make sure that if we do a pre-competitive consortium, we brought the payer side in, and we would say to everybody, this is the value of the data. First of all, it's standardized. It's exactly what you were looking for. I would make it better than, I would learn everything we did from Compass 1.0, and I would say, now everybody wants immune data. We have thousands of tissue samples.
Whoever's generating the data, I think, should be also responsible for going the next step and sharing that data. It's not, we don't treat patients and stop.
Comment about bringing in some of the payers to have this conversation, because I know Sharon, we've on that genomic workshop, we've had a lot of third-party payers, and I think the key message we've heard from them over and over again is clinical utility research is not our responsibility. Don't look to us to help pay for this. So what did they say?
It was interesting. First, they were a great group, but the difference was the question we were asking. So again, an example we gave them, I'm sorry I keep going back to myeloma, it's just the one I know the best, but the example we gave them was, In the world of myeloma, it took us, when I was diagnosed, patients lived 3 years. We didn't have a single drug. Now, because we did work as an ecosystem, we have 10 drugs approved. So now what happens with myeloma is we don't live 3 years, we live more like 9 or 10 years. The disease is still fatal, but so much progress. But what happens is you get into remission, and now everybody's putting you on maintenance therapy. So me as a patient, I'm in a complete remission from a stem cell transplant. That was 2006. I stayed on maintenance therapy for a certain period of time. Everybody said, stay on maintenance therapy, stay on maintenance therapy. I didn't enjoy being on maintenance therapy. I didn't want to be on the drug, but I had no idea whether I should stay on or stay not. Again, why data is so important. I made the decision that I wouldn't stay on treatment after those years were over. So it has now been, actually my transplant anniversary is today, it's now been 11 years, and I've been off maintenance for 8.
Data sharing costs money. Like you mentioned that if you told your group tomorrow you got to share all your data, they're looking at FTEs, they're looking at time and so forth. So I think a culture of building into a research project the cost of curating and sharing that data is a cultural shift that I think we want to really be enabling here.
So maybe we'll start with you, Bob. What are your thoughts there on expanding the structure or potentially the risks of not making the structure scalable to include early pre-malignancies?
Well, I mean, the people who are generating this data, it's fragmented. I mean, you've got laboratories, the vast majority of which are delivering PDFs or faxes into electronic medical records, which is completely unacceptable. But I think that at some point, the different sites where this data is being generated, this has to be brought together so that following the patient is keyed up with what has the patient's genetic and genomic information been, as well as other sorts of phenotypic information about that patient. So I think defragmenting the data is really a key point of trying to accomplish, John, what you've been talking about.
I think if we could figure out ways that we begin to dashboard in very transparent ways for the people themselves. So to Bob's point, all my life from the day that I'm born till whenever, I can see a dashboard of when I'm healthy, when I'm not, what's impacting that, my environmental data, et cetera. And the clinicians can start to see, when is it that you're responding better? When do I see you maybe ramping up toward an illness, whether it's diabetes or something else?
If there were one, maybe I'll just go around with the different perspectives. If there were one thing that would, from your perspective and a value perspective, improve data sharing and improve value from that, what would that be? Maybe we can start with Rob.
I would say the number one piece of value would be to make sure that there is structured genetic and genomic data attached to every patient. That patient, of course, has to have control over that. It's their own personal decision as to whether they want to do that or not. But that information is available and mineable when in a context of knowing much more about the phenotype of that patient, both health and any medical issues that have occurred with the patient.
I don't think that we're going to end up in this model where there's just one big pool of everybody sharing data. It's not going to happen. It's going to be a federated system, hopefully not a huge archipelago of all these islands of data, but fewer, bigger islands with bridges across them. And you can't do that without standards.
I also just want to bring in this, the patients really being empowered to enable and to accelerate data sharing and finding ways to allow patients to deposit their own data, and there be portals and support systems for them to do so, I think will enable data sharing.
And to Kathy's point earlier, it's really hard to get people to understand that the answer is us. I just had a paper come out in Science Translational Medicine in which I said there's 2 secrets. And the first is, my doctor doesn't know, and neither do I, the answer. And the second is, I'm the answer. And we don't let people know that.
If I had to choose one thing and try to be different, I would say we need some value demonstration. We keep arguing that it's valuable to share data. And we need to have really big, in-your-face, undeniable demonstration of that speaks to the stakeholders, because when that's seen, I think the rest will fall into place.
Well, I want to thank our panel for their attention, for giving up their time, for their intellect, for their contribution. I want to thank you all for your attention. And we'll be available, and I'm sure my panelists will be available here after the meeting as well. So thank you very much for attending.